The hum of the airplane cabin was a familiar sound, passengers settling into their seats, the occasional ding of the overhead announcement, and the murmur of conversations blending with the soft rustling of flight attendants moving down the aisle. Among them was Sarah, a seasoned air hostess with years of experience in the industry. She prided herself on her professionalism, but today her patience was running thin. It had been a long shift, and she was eager to get through the routine service as quickly as possible. In seat 3A, near the front of the first-class cabin, sat a well-dressed man, his posture relaxed yet commanding. His name was Daniel, though few on this flight knew that. With his tailored suit and effortless confidence, he blended in with the other high-paying passengers, except for one detail that seemed to make Sarah pause. He was a black man. Something in her expression shifted the moment she laid eyes on him. It wasn't obvious, just a fleeting hesitation, a slight tightening of her jaw. But to Daniel, it was nothing new. He had experienced this before, the quick glances, the subtle change in tone when speaking to him, the assumption that he didn't belong in spaces like this. He had learned to ignore it. He had built himself up from nothing, worked harder than anyone could imagine, and now he was sitting in a seat that he not only paid for but technically owned. Because what Sarah didn't know, what no one on this plane knew, was that Daniel was the owner of this airline. The beverage cart clattered slightly as Sarah stopped beside him, her polished smile in place, but her tone clipped. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, already half turning to grab a glass, as if she expected him to take whatever was offered. Daniel met her eyes with a calm, steady gaze. "A coffee, please. Black." She nodded curtly and reached for the pot, pouring the steaming liquid into a cup. But something about her movements seemed rushed, almost irritated. The next second, as she turned to hand him the coffee, the cup tilted, and in an instant, scalding liquid splashed across Daniel's chest. A sharp gasp rippled through the nearby passengers. The burning sensation hit immediately, but Daniel didn't flinch. He inhaled sharply, gripping the armrests of his seat as the hot coffee soaked into his shirt. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, but her voice lacked the genuine concern one would expect from such a mistake. Her eyes flickered with something else, annoyance, perhaps, as if she hadn't expected him to react the way he did, as if she had expected him to yell, to make a scene. Instead, Daniel simply picked up a napkin and dabbed at his shirt. His expression remained unreadable. "Accidents happen," he said smoothly, his voice controlled. But Sarah's demeanor didn't change. There was something dismissive in the way she stood there, holding the empty coffee pot, as if waiting for him to wave it off so she could move on. Passengers around them whispered, exchanging glances. Some looked at Sarah, some at Daniel. A few seemed uncomfortable, sensing the tension in the air. Daniel exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. He wasn't the type to play into anyone's expectations. He wasn't here to be disrespected in silence, and he certainly wasn't about to let this go unnoticed. He leaned back, still dabbing at his shirt. "You seem a little rushed," he said, his voice even but firm. Sarah forced a small chuckle, shifting her weight. "It's been a long flight," she said. "Again, I apologize." But Daniel wasn't looking for an apology. He was watching her reaction. The way she had hesitated before speaking to him, the way she seemed unconcerned after spilling hot coffee on a first-class passenger, the way she had already turned to move on, as if he didn't matter. He tapped his fingers against the armrest, considering his next move. The truth was, Sarah had no idea who she was speaking to. No idea that she had just poured coffee on the very man who could decide her future with a single phone call. And as the plane soared through the sky, unaware of the storm brewing within its walls, Daniel made a decision. This flight wasn't over yet. Daniel sat still, his fingers absently tapping against the armrest as he watched Sarah move down the aisle. She didn't look back. If she had, she might have noticed the way his expression had changed, not with anger, but with something deeper, something far more controlled. He had spent years building his name, his business, his empire. He had faced challenges far greater than an inattentive flight attendant with a dismissive attitude. But this was different. It wasn't the coffee. It wasn't even the half-hearted apology. It was the way she had treated him, the way she had barely acknowledged him as if he didn't belong here. He could see it in her body language, in the way she moved with a little more ease when speaking to other passengers. He had seen this kind of treatment before, too many times. And he had learned, long ago, that silence was never the answer. He glanced down at his shirt. The dark fabric clung to his skin, the heat having faded but leaving a visible stain. He could still feel the eyes of a few passengers flickering toward him, but no one said a word. It was the unspoken rule of first class. People minded their own business. No one wanted to get involved. A soft sigh escaped him as he leaned back in his seat, his mind shifting to the irony of the situation. He had flown on his airline countless times, often unnoticed, always observing. He liked to see how things ran from the ground level, how employees treated customers when they thought no one important was watching. Sometimes he boarded flights just to test the waters, to see the service firsthand. But never had he encountered something quite like this. The attendant in charge of first-class service, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a polite smile, walked down the aisle, his eyes sweeping over the passengers. When he reached Daniel's seat, his gaze flickered to the stain on his shirt. He hesitated before speaking. "Sir, is everything all right?" His voice was even professional. Daniel looked up, meeting his gaze. "Your colleague spilled coffee on me." His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, something unreadable. The attendant's eyes flickered with concern. "I sincerely apologize for that. Would you like me to bring you a fresh shirt from our emergency kit?" Daniel considered the offer, then shook his head. "No, thank you." He wasn't interested in changing clothes. He was interested in something else. The attendant nodded respectfully. "If there's anything else I can do." "There is," Daniel interrupted smoothly. "What's her name?" The attendant hesitated. "Sarah," he said carefully. Daniel nodded slowly. "Thank you." The man lingered for a second, as if debating whether to say more, but then he simply inclined his head and continued down the aisle. Daniel settled back into his seat, his thoughts turning. He wasn't one to make hasty decisions. He never had been. Every move he made was calculated, deliberate. That was how he had built his success. Outside the small window, the sky stretched in endless shades of blue and white, the sun casting golden light over the horizon. He had always loved flying, always admired the beauty of it, the way it made the world seem both vast and small all at once. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the message on the screen. **** board meeting rescheduled. Updates needed on expansion plans ****. He sighed, rubbing his temple before typing back a quick reply. Business never stopped, even at 35,000 feet. He had meetings lined up the moment he landed, discussions about the company's growth, potential acquisitions, future investments. The airline was only one piece of his empire, but it was a crucial one. He had built it with a vision, to redefine luxury travel, to make it seamless, effortless. And yet, here he was, sitting in first class, experiencing the kind of treatment that went against everything he had worked for. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Sir?" He looked up to see a woman standing beside his seat, a fellow passenger, perhaps in her mid-40s, dressed in a casual but elegant outfit. Her expression held quiet concern. "I saw what happened earlier," she said softly, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "That was unacceptable." Daniel studied her for a moment. She wasn't looking for attention. She wasn't trying to make a scene. She had simply seen something wrong and had chosen to speak up. He offered a small smile. "I appreciate that." She hesitated, then said, "I've flown on this airline many times. The service is usually excellent, but that flight attendant, she was different with you." He nodded slightly, acknowledging her words without confirming or denying them. After a pause, she added, I just thought you should know that not everyone ignores things like that. With that, she gave a polite nod and returned to her seat. Daniel watched her go, a small flicker of something unreadable in his expression. It wasn't about the coffee. It wasn't even about Sarah, not entirely. It was about something bigger. People assumed things. They looked at him and saw what they wanted to see. And sometimes, they underestimated the wrong person. He reached up and pressed the call button. Within seconds, Sarah appeared, her expression carefully neutral. Yes, sir. Daniel studied her for a moment before speaking. His voice was measured, calm. I'd like to speak to the captain. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. The captain? Yes, he said simply. Sarah hesitated. Is there a problem? He let the silence stretch just long enough to make her uneasy. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, he said, You could say that. She swallowed, shifting on her feet. I'll let her know. As she turned to walk away, Daniel watched her go, his expression unreadable. The flight wasn't over yet. Sarah walked briskly down the aisle, her heart pounding. The way he had looked at her, the way he had spoken, it unsettled her. There was something about this man, something she couldn't quite place, but it made her nervous. She had been working as a flight attendant for years, dealing with all kinds of passengers, from entitled businessmen to exhausted parents juggling crying babies. But this was different. Reaching the cockpit door, she hesitated for a second before knocking lightly. A moment later, the door cracked open, and the co-pilot peeked out. The gentleman in 3 wants to speak to the captain, she said, keeping her voice steady. The co-pilot's brows furrowed. What's this about? I'm not sure, she admitted, glancing over her shoulder. He didn't say. The captain, a tall man with streaks of silver in his hair, leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Who is he? Sarah hesitated, shifting on her feet. Just a passenger, she said quickly, but even as she spoke, she knew that wasn't the full truth. Something told her this man wasn't just another passenger. The captain exhaled, thinking for a moment. All right, let's not make a scene. I'll go see what he wants. As Sarah turned to walk back to the cabin, she felt uneasy. Something about the way this was unfolding didn't sit right with her. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his seat, his mind working through every possible scenario. He wasn't someone who acted impulsively. Everything he did was intentional, calculated. He had spent years mastering the art of patience, knowing when to speak and when to wait. But this situation needed to be addressed now. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed. Disappointed that someone in his own airline had treated a passenger this way. It wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever felt like they didn't belong in spaces like this. And that was something he couldn't ignore. A few minutes later, he saw movement near the front of the cabin. The captain was walking toward him, his expression neutral but curious. Sir, I understand you asked to speak with me. Daniel looked up, nodding slightly. That's right. The captain glanced at Sarah, who stood a few feet away, looking uncomfortable. He turned back to Daniel. Is there a problem? Daniel studied him for a moment before speaking. I'd like to have a conversation, privately. The captain hesitated, but then gestured toward the small lounge area near the front of first class. Of course. As Daniel rose from his seat, he felt the weight of several eyes on him. People were watching, whispering. But he ignored them. This wasn't about putting on a show. This was about setting a standard. Once inside the lounge area, the captain closed the door behind them. How can I help you, sir? Daniel leaned against the wall, his gaze steady. First, let me introduce myself properly. My name is Daniel Carter. He let the name settle, watching for a reaction. The captain frowned slightly, the name clearly familiar, but not fully clicking yet. All right. Daniel exhaled slowly, giving the man a moment before continuing. I own this airline. The captain's eyes widened slightly, his body tensing. He stopped, clearing his throat. I wasn't aware. Daniel nodded. I like to fly unannounced. I like to see how things run when no one knows who I am. The captain shifted on his feet. I see. Do you? Daniel asked, his voice calm but firm, because what I experienced today tells me we have a problem. The captain remained silent, his posture straightening. Daniel continued, I don't expect special treatment. I don't expect perfection. But what I do expect is basic respect for every passenger, no matter who they are or what they look like. His voice never rose, but there was an unmistakable intensity behind his words. The way your flight attendant handled me today was unacceptable, not because of a spilled cup of coffee, but because of how she looked at me, how she dismissed me, how she made it clear, without saying a word, that she didn't think I belonged in this seat. The captain's face remained composed, but Daniel could see the realization settling in. I built this airline on the idea that luxury travel should be an experience, not just a service, that every passenger should feel valued, and if that's not happening, then something needs to change. The captain let out a slow breath. I understand, Mr. Carter, and I assure you this will be addressed. Daniel nodded, pushing away from the wall. Good. As he turned to leave, the captain spoke again. Sir, if I may ask, why didn't you say something sooner? Daniel paused at the door, glancing back. A small, knowing smile touched his lips, because I wanted to see how far it would go. With that, he stepped back into the main cabin, walking toward his seat with the same quiet confidence he had when he boarded. Sarah stood nearby, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But Daniel could see it now, the worry, the realization sinking in. He didn't say anything to her as he sat back down. He didn't need to. The flight continued as normal, the tension lingering in the air, thick and unspoken. But one thing was certain. The moment they landed, things were going to change. The hum of the airplane engines felt louder now, the tension in the cabin thick, stretching between the seats like an invisible current. Conversations were quieter, eyes darting toward Daniel every now and then before quickly looking away. Word traveled fast, even in first class. Sarah's face was pale, her usual air of confidence now replaced with something more uncertain. She had been avoiding Daniel's gaze ever since he had returned from his conversation with the captain. Daniel sat calmly in his seat, but his mind was anything but still. He had been in boardrooms filled with high-powered executives, in meetings where millions of dollars were at stake, and yet the silence of this flight held an entirely different weight. He had started this journey expecting just another flight, another chance to observe, to evaluate. He hadn't expected it to turn into something personal. The flight attendants continued their service, moving through the cabin with forced smiles, their movements precise, careful. Sarah, however, seemed hesitant now. She glanced at Daniel from a distance, her fingers tightening around the edge of the beverage cart as if bracing herself. Passengers exchanged knowing looks, their curiosity barely concealed. A few seemed to know who he was now. Maybe they had searched his name, maybe they had overheard the conversation with the captain. Either way, the energy had shifted. Then, the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came through. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into New York. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. The words signaled the nearing end of the flight, but for Daniel, it marked something else entirely, the beginning of what would happen once they landed. He reached for his phone, unlocking it with a quick swipe. A flood of unread messages waited for him, but one, in particular, caught his attention. It was from his assistant, Claire. *** Sarah, last name Bennett. 5 years with the airline, multiple complaints, no action taken ***. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly as he read. So this wasn't just a one-time mistake. She had a history. And worse, no one had done anything about it. He glanced up just in time to see Sarah walking toward him, her steps slower than before, her posture stiff. When she reached his row, she hesitated for a second before speaking. Mr. Carter. Her voice was quieter now, less dismissive, but still guarded. He looked at her, waiting. Hi. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for earlier. The words felt forced, rehearsed. Her eyes flickered to the empty cup in his holder as if the coffee spill was the only thing she was acknowledging. Daniel studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. What exactly are you sorry for? Sarah swallowed, clearly caught off guard by the question. For the coffee, she said quickly. For the accident. Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. It wasn't the coffee, he said simply. Sarah's fingers curled at her sides, and for the first time, real worry flickered across her face. She knew. Before she could say anything else, the plane jolted slightly as it descended through a patch of turbulence. A few gasps filled the cabin, and Sarah instinctively grabbed the side of a seat to steady herself. Daniel didn't move, his focus still on her. He could see it now, the realization dawning in her eyes. She had underestimated him. She had assumed he was just another passenger, someone she could brush off without consequences. And now she was realizing just how wrong she had been. The plane continued its descent, the city lights of New York flickering through the windows. Time was running out. In a matter of minutes, they would be on the ground, and the moment of truth would arrive. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the armrest. He had a choice to make. And Sarah knew it. As the plane made its final approach, she took a small step back, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The fear in her eyes said it all. The wheels touched the ground with a smooth glide, the familiar pull of landing pressing everyone back into their seats. A collective breath filled the cabin as the engines slowed, the plane rolling toward the gate. Outside, the terminal lights glowed brightly, illuminating the end of the flight. But for Sarah, the real turbulence was just about to begin. As the plane taxied to the gate, Sarah stood near the front, gripping the edge of the jump seat. Her breathing was steady, but her mind raced. She had never felt this kind of uncertainty before. Something told her that the moment the doors opened, everything would change. Daniel remained seated, his expression unreadable. He wasn't in a rush to stand, to grab his bag like the other passengers who were already shifting impatiently. Instead, he sat still, watching, waiting. The energy in the cabin had shifted completely. The flight attendants whispered to one another, throwing nervous glances in his direction. They all knew now. As the seatbelt sign turned off with a soft chime, passengers immediately began unbuckling, stretching, reaching for their bags in the overhead compartments. The air buzzed with quiet tension, conversations spoken in hushed voices. Sarah glanced at the captain, who was stepping out of the cockpit, his face neutral but tight with unease. He met Daniel's gaze for a moment, then looked away, exhaling slowly. One of the other flight attendants nudged Sarah slightly. "Are you okay?" she whispered. Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't, because the truth was she wasn't sure. Then, just as the doors were about to open, a second chime sounded, and an unexpected voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that passengers in first class remain seated for a brief moment. There is a slight delay with disembarkation." A murmur rippled through the cabin. A delay. Sarah's breath caught. That was not standard procedure. Something was happening. Daniel, however, remained calm. He already knew. A few seconds later, two uniformed airline officials stepped onto the plane, their expressions serious. They walked with purpose, their eyes scanning the cabin before landing directly on Sarah. "Miss Bennett," one of them said, his voice firm but professional. "Please step forward." The blood drained from Sarah's face. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She hesitated, her pulse racing. What's going on?" The official didn't waver. "We need to have a conversation before you leave the aircraft." Sarah's throat tightened. Is this about the coffee?" She forced a weak laugh, but no one joined in. Daniel finally stood, adjusting the cuffs of his stained shirt as he stepped into the aisle. "No, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than anything the officials had said. "This isn't just about coffee." A heavy silence filled the cabin. Even the other passengers, those who had tried to mind their own business, were now fully invested in whatever was unfolding. Sarah swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. She turned to the captain, hoping for some kind of support, but he only gave her a slow, regretful nod. The second official spoke up, his voice softer but firm. "Please, Miss Bennet." Sarah had no choice. With slow, reluctant steps, she walked past Daniel toward the front of the plane. Her heart pounded so loudly, she could barely hear the murmurs around her. Daniel watched her go, his expression still unreadable. He wasn't enjoying this moment, but he also wasn't about to stop it. As Sarah disappeared with the officials, the tension in the cabin remained thick. The remaining flight attendants stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. Finally, one of the passengers, a businessman seated across from Daniel, cleared his throat. That was unexpected. Daniel exhaled, adjusting his watch before looking toward the exit. "Not really," he said simply. And with that, the doors finally opened, and passengers began to disembark. But the flight for Sarah was far from over. Sarah's legs felt heavy as she stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, flanked by the two airline officials. The murmurs of passengers still inside the cabin faded behind her, but she could feel their eyes, their judgment. Her heart pounded, her breaths shallow and uneven. They led her through a side door into a small private lounge near the gate. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making the room feel cold and clinical. One of the officials gestured for her to take a seat at the long table in the center of the room. She hesitated before slowly lowering herself into the chair. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask what was happening. But before she could form a sentence, the door behind them opened again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Daniel. He walked in, calm and composed, a quiet authority surrounding him. He had changed into a fresh shirt, one that wasn't stained with coffee, but his expression remained the same, firm, unreadable. He pulled out a chair across from Sarah and sat down. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt thick, the silence pressing against her chest. Finally, Daniel leaned forward, folding his hands together. "Sarah," he said, his voice even, "do you know why you are here?" Sarah swallowed hard. "Because of what happened on the flight." Daniel nodded slightly. "Partly." He let the word hang for a second before continuing. "But it's not just about today." Sarah's fingers gripped the edge of the table. She glanced at the officials, looking for some kind of escape, but there was none. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he turned the screen toward her. A document, names, complaints, a record of every incident she thought had been brushed under the rug. Sarah's breath hitched. "I didn't." Daniel's voice remained steady. "You did." He locked eyes with her. "And it's not just me who noticed." The weight of it all hit her at once. She had gotten away with so much for so long. Ignored warnings, dismissed complaints, assumed nothing would ever happen. But now she was face to face with someone who wasn't going to look the other way. One of the officials cleared his throat. "Miss Bennet, after reviewing your conduct and multiple passenger reports over the years, the airline has made a decision." Sarah's stomach twisted. "Wait." Daniel's expression didn't change. "You're being dismissed from your position, effective immediately." The words rang in her ears. The room seemed to close in around her. She felt herself sinking, unable to breathe. "This can't be happening," she whispered. Daniel stood, adjusting his cuffs. "I built this airline with the belief that every passenger, every person, deserves to be treated with respect," he said. "That's a standard I won't compromise on." Sarah's chest rose and fell rapidly, her mind spinning, searching for something, anything to say, but there was nothing left. Daniel turned toward the door, the officials following. Just as he reached the exit, he glanced back at her one last time. "It was never about the coffee, Sarah," he said. "It was about the choice you made." And with that, he stepped out, leaving Sarah alone in the empty room, with nothing but the consequences of her actions. Sarah sat frozen in the empty room, staring at the door long after it had closed. The silence felt deafening, her own heartbeat drumming in her ears. It was over. The career she had built, the confidence she had worn like armor, the sense of control she always carried, it had all been stripped away in a matter of minutes. She had always assumed she could get away with anything, that her mistakes would be forgotten. But this time was different. This time she had been wrong. Her mind replayed the moment Daniel spoke those final words. It was never about the coffee. It was about the choice you made, The weight of that truth sank into her chest, heavier than anything she had felt before. It wasn't just today's mistake that had cost her. It was the choices she had been making for years. The dismissive tone, the assumptions, the carelessness with how she treated people. She had always believed she was untouchable. She wasn't. Meanwhile, Daniel walked through the bustling airport terminal, his pace steady, his mind clear. He had been in situations far more intense than this, but something about today stayed with him. He had seen people like Sarah before, people who assumed power came from a title or a uniform, people who forgot the simple truth that respect wasn't just expected, it was earned. Claire, his assistant, was waiting near the exit. She held up her phone when she saw him approaching. "News is already spreading," she said, scrolling through her screen. "Some passengers must have posted about what happened." Daniel glanced at the phone, but he wasn't surprised. Word traveled fast, especially in a world where social media could turn a private moment into a public discussion within minutes. "What's the reaction?" he asked as they walked toward the car waiting outside. Claire exhaled. "Mixed. Some people are saying it was about time someone held airline staff accountable. Others think it was too harsh." Daniel nodded, expecting as much. "It's not about harshness," he said. "It's about standards." They reached the black car parked near the curb. As they climbed in, Claire hesitated before speaking again. "You could have just let HR handle it quietly. Why make it so direct?" Daniel looked out the window for a moment before answering. "Because she needed to understand," he said. "If I had walked away, she wouldn't have. She would have found another job, done the same thing, treated someone else the same way." Claire nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "And do you think she'll change?" Daniel considered that for a moment. He didn't know. People could change, but only if they wanted to. Only if they were willing to see their mistakes, to learn from them. He had given Sarah that moment, the moment to truly see herself. Whether she chose to do anything with it was up to her. As the car pulled away from the airport, Daniel leaned back in his seat, exhaling. Another flight, another experience, another reminder of why he had built his airline the way he had. It wasn't just about luxury or business, it was about people. Sarah, meanwhile, finally found the strength to stand. The room felt colder now, emptier. She walked toward the door, her steps slower, her thoughts heavier. She had spent years thinking she was untouchable, that her mistakes would never catch up to her. But now, standing at this crossroads, she realized something she had never let herself think before. Maybe it wasn't too late to change. The terminal outside was alive with movement, passengers rushing to their gates, families reuniting, people moving forward. Sarah took a breath, stepped out of the room, and disappeared into the crowd, unsure of where she was headed next, but knowing one thing for certain: she would never make the same mistake again.